Explain the early approaches to human behavior at workplace. Describe the limitation of early approaches and growth of human relation tradition. Explain the Hawthorne experiment and influence of Elton Mayo. Analyze the limitation of human relation tradition. Examine the growth of the later human relations approaches. Society is formed by individuals. An individual can be studied by their behavior. It was seen that people behave in a set pattern to certain incidents. As such, scholars realized that empirical study of the behavior of individuals in a given situation could lead to a better understanding of society in general. Further studies showed that behavior in turn was influenced by various factors, and in modern society, organizations shaped human behavior and their approach to certain issues. With people spending more time in their workplace, the organizations became an intrinsic part of modern man. They not only worked but also developed skills in their workplace. They formed groups and were motivated by their working conditions. They set goals and made their work a means to self-realization. This forced scholars to study workplace behavior and relations forged into shop floor to understand the influence of organization on human behavior better. These studies later on formed the basis for solving the managerial and workplace related problems in factories and industries. Studies showed that human interaction in many cases created the organizational structure. In a workplace, it was seen that attitude of an individual and behavior were further shaped by factors like technology, authority, role definition, communication network, interpersonal influences, and face-to-face interaction. This encouraged the scholars to study each aspect of workplace in greater depth. In this discussion, we will try to analyze these studies and their results. We will also try to understand why such studies were made, the reasons for their failure, and the advent of various new approaches as a counter to earlier studies. The early approaches to human behavior at work. There were three most prominent approaches that were developed to study human behavior at workplace. These were the classic economic approach, the scientific management of F.W. Taylor, and finally the physiology and psychological approach. All these three approaches were in due course criticized for their oversimplified and over-rational attitude towards workers. However, the study of these early approaches is essential to have a better understanding of studies that were made later on. One of the earliest studies on human behavior at work was that of classical economics. Of course, the study was derived from the well-known principle of laissez-faire or free market. This approach was based on the assumption that every individual must be given the opportunity to act according to their desire and towards the realization of their self-interest. It focused on the efficiency, productivity, and the output of the employees. This was going to affect the productivity of the organization as a whole and in turn help employees reach their goal of satisfactory life. The second most influential approach was developed by Frederick Winslow Taylor and was called scientific management. During 1880s and 1890, Taylor studied various scientific methods employing which an industrial work could be made more productive. Taylor chalked out few mechanisms such as the elimination of waste, standardized best practices, and empiricism in shop floor to make the work more efficient. The study aimed to attain harmonious cooperation between manager and workers by achieving efficiency to its greatest level and thereby increasing the income of both. It was based on the assumption that incentives used in a proper manner could increase labor productivity, and this would further result in increased profit. Taylor's scientific management became the most influential study of human behavior during that age in manufacturing industries. However, these early approaches were severely criticized for ignoring human factor in the workplace. Workers were treated as machine and their desire, aspiration as well as human error were not taken into consideration and generated a lot of controversy. Major source of criticism came from the research done on industrial physiology and psychology by scholars like Friedman and Rose. This research also formed the third most valuable early approach to human behavior at workplace. This approach took into account the effect of fatigue and difference in work ability of workers. They also discussed the effect of environmental conditions such as heating, lighting, and hour of work had on the workers' psychology and health. The study showed that such environmental conditions had an immense effect on workers' behavior at workplace. It studies the human factor which was not taken into consideration by earlier studies. It also analyzed the effect of monotony on workers' mind. In due course, Elton, Mayo, and various other proponents of human relation movement explained human behavior in a very different perspective than simply connecting it with the work environment. Human relation movement reacted against all early approaches for their individualistic aspect. Later on, studies were made to understand the social factor that worked within a factory along with the effect of workers' interaction with each other on productivity. The Hawthorne experiment. The growing appreciation for social factors and their cumulative effect on human behavior formed the basis of Hawthorne experiment. Earlier approaches tried to mitigate the cause of inefficiency and dissatisfaction among workers only on materialistic terms. They failed to recognize that within the factory wall workers forged social bond. This compelled the investigators to study social factors while explaining the result of their research. So, an experiment was conducted at Hawthorne Works, a Western electric factory in Chicago during 1927 and 1932. This experiment formed the foundation of the human relation movement. The whole experiment was divided into three main stages. In the first stage, which was called the illumination test, researchers wanted to see the effect of physical work environment on the workers. However, researchers were unable to find any correlation between the two, but the productivity increased due to the increased supervision and a growing sense of competition among the group of workers. The second experiment, called relay assembly, was conducted on a small group of women workers for 5 years. Different variables were used, such as a break of 5 minutes, a break of 10 minutes, providing food during break, shortening the day by 30 minutes. It was seen that changing variables increased productivity. Researchers realized that conditions like having a sympathetic supervisor or having a right to choose one's co-worker or working group resulted in greater productivity. The third experiment was conducted by Elton, Mayo and Lord Warner during 1931 and 32 for a period of 6 months. This study was called bank wiring room experiments and was conducted on a group of 14 men. The researchers recognized the existence of informal groups within formal groups and how payment incentives affected the productivity of workers. The study revealed how these informal groups controlled the level of output and the behavior of the worker. Finally, the study established factory as a component of the social system, and it also established the historical importance of the study. The study had a huge impact, especially in the later growth of human relation movement. However, it was not totally devoid of its own drawbacks. The techniques that were used in experiments were unrefined in comparison to studies that were done later. Also, the interpretation of the final result also differed from investigator to investigator. Influence of Elton, Mayo. Industrial revolution has resulted in the breakdown of pre-existing society and its values. Mayo realized that the current knowledge of social process was inadequate to create an adaptive society. Mayo termed this lack of usual social and ethical standards in an individual's life as anomie. He sought to solve this problem of anomie through developing social skills among individuals. He interpreted the managers' and administrators' relations with their workers under the scheme of social skills. In Hawthorne experiment, he demonstrated the scope of having spontaneous cooperation among workers by the development of sense of belonging and social purpose. He interpreted conflict as pathological, which could be resolved by encouraging a sense of the social bond and shared purpose among workers and managers. It was Mayo who developed and believed that workers needed social satisfaction along with material reward for remaining productive and efficient. The research on human relations in industry. Hawthorne experiment had raised many issues related to human behavior in the workplace. These issues were taken up in most of the research done under human relation tradition. Along with the outcome from Hawthorne, experiment inputs were also taken from other sources. As such, under this situation, we find studies being done on many other themes and in a varied way. The most notable study was made by Hawthorne and White during 1951 to 1969 on the structure and functioning of small groups in the industries. They analytically developed a framework to understand the concept of interaction among informal groups. The Hawthorne experiments had established the power of these informal groups. The study of Hawthorne and White further explained the amount of influence they enjoyed within the organization. Second most significant study was conducted by Warner and Lowe during 1947. They tried to explore the industry and community links. During 1950s, many studies were undertaken on leadership style and group participation in decision making. Relationship between certain key factors such as productivity and morale were analyzed. Such researches were highlighted in the work of Levin and those who were studying authoritarian, laissez-faire and democratic style of leadership in small groups. The limitation of the human relations tradition. The human relation tradition has also been criticized many grounds by recent critics. These critics have cited that Elton Mayo, while doing his research, failed to appreciate the work done by churches, community groups, and trade unions in achieving social integration. Also, the factory workers whom Mayo studies in his experiment were immigrants. They were first or second generation immigrants who had to live in rapidly changing social environment and growing urban area. As such, the anomie that Mayo talked about may not be the chief feature among other group of workers in a different location. Though the human relation tradition has severely criticized earlier approaches for being obsessed about material reward, the impact of economic reward on workers cannot be denied. In fact, human relations tradition was criticized for overemphasizing interpersonal relations and totally ignoring materialistic aspirations of workers. This tradition was found inadequate in relation to the problem raised by conflict of interest over distribution of income and the power distribution between management and workers. The need for cohesive group was clearly significant in a workplace for social satisfaction of workers, but equally important was the question of economic reward, wage and income that had to be distributed within enterprise, and power tussle that continuously cropped up between management and workers group. The tradition failed to devise successful solution to these problems. Hawthorne experiments have also been criticized for the relative absence of study on trade union, the most famous group that is formed in a factory. Trade union did not exist in Hawthorne works in 1927. However, the subsequent studies under human relation tradition have also not incorporated any research on trade union and industrial relations. While other informal groups have been discussed, the tradition has failed to examine the origin, function, and influence of trade union on workers. It has also been seen that socio-psychological aspect of groups within the factory has been studied, but studies have not dealt with the economic and social forces that existed outside the factory or plant, which also had the effect on management and workers' behavior. Although the human relation tradition did a great deal of work in explaining work group and work supervisor relation, but the influence of larger organizational and social setting on such relation were left aside. Criticism has generated from the fact that research under this tradition were done to endorse the interest of management in various plants. It helped to increase management's control over the workers. The criticism gained more ground as this tradition failed to recognize the conflicting values of groups within in industrial societies. The researchers were used to enforce managerial practices, and researchers further accepted management's definition of goal for the enterprise. The questions were raised against the value orientation of these investigators and scholars. They failed to acknowledge the inherent conflict and change that marked the production system in factories and plants. Their fixation with collaboration and stability in society failed to generate scientific solution to the problems that existed. Finally, the human relations approach was infested with intrinsic theoretical and methodological weakness. They extensively relied on empirical research but did not generate theories which could be applied in a similar situation. They also restricted themselves from taking theories and concepts from other sources. As such, their studies seemed limited and incomplete to cater any problem. Later, human relations approach. Understanding of limitations of human relation tradition and new advances that occurred around the world led to the development of new human relations. While human relation tradition tried to study the social man, the new tradition felt the need to understand self-actualizing man or complex man. This study was derived from the awareness that man had various needs. These needs could be classified into various categories. It ranged in the hierarchy from simple need of survival to safety, security, and finally self-actualization. These needs required man to make optimum use of available resource, which subsequently gave him job satisfaction. In the work of Marlowe, Herzberg, Wall and Stephenson studies shows that man continuously worked to meet his needs, which ranged from general hygiene to motivating factors such as recognition and achievement. These scholars generated alternative managerial philosophies to help workers achieve his needs and bring harmony in workflow. The technological implication approach. This study was primarily based on nature of technology or the production system in a workplace. Under this approach, scholars tried to explain the role technology played in influencing social relation and behavior in industry. The researchers here tried to recognize various production systems and identify the inherent social characteristic in each system. While this research initially began in the manufacturing industries, in recent years it has been adopted by other sorts of organizations. Few of the first studies were conducted by Woodward during 1958 and 1965. She wanted to explain the structure of management organization in a large sample firms. She tried to study the differences in technical complexity and the extent to which control could be exercised over manufacturing operations. During 1962, a French sociologist, Turenne, also distinguished three main stages in the development of technology. This development, he studies, occurred on one hand from disintegration of workers' skill and on the other from mechanization of these tasks. In 1964, Blonder further distinguished four main stages in development of technology. The writers under this approach have suggested that technology sets a limit within which management policies operate. Technology determines the role structure of the organization, which further constrains social relation and behavior. Economic structure, along with character and expectation of labor force, may also lead to differences. Socio-technical systems and organizational choice. This approach was developed by the members of Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. This concept propagated that a production system not only required a technological organization but also a work organization. The work organization must help workers to relate with each other in carrying out a given task. Study forwarded the idea that through technological organization placed constraints, work organization had its own socio-psychological properties that made it independent of technology. The study further analyzed that social, technological and economic dimensions all had independent value of their own, though they looked interdependent. The researchers advocated the deliberate creation of work groups comprising workers skilled at performing several tasks. It was suggested that such groups must be given a certain amount of responsible autonomy to regulate and coordinate their own activities. Further, their wages were assigned according to the quality and quantity of output they generated. This concept was applied in the coal mines of Britain and cotton industry in India. The changes suggested by scholars and socio-technical system resulted in marked improvement in productivity and morale. The results emphasized the importance of choice of social organization within given technological setup, the social action approach and the orientations to work. In 1967, Turner and his colleague pointed out that technology could not explain the occurrences of strike in motor companies of Britain. Similarly, job enlargement, job rotation, group working, an appropriate style of supervisory leadership had also failed to resolve these strikes. Studies on the affluent workers in the three firms of Britain highlighted that workers dislike the actual task they perform, not because of job dissatisfaction, but because they had a complaint with the management or supervisors. Nor did they look for a close relationship with fellow workers or supportive supervision. Such finding was later on explained by researchers as workers' instrumental orientation to work, seeking only high level of economic rewards. Workers did not mind technological difficulties until their need for expenditure on their homes and families, which were central interest of their life, were fulfilled. In addition to this, Hawthorne also suggested that orientations to work were formed mostly outside the factory. These workers were influenced by their family, community, and class situations, which conditioned their choice of work. Workers also chose their place of work in accordance with their orientation. Thus, researchers suggested that attitudes and behavior at work must be explained in reference with non-work factors. Social system of the factory itself could not be the principal factor while making such choice. This line of argument has received support from many scholars and have encouraged investigation of the workers' society. This approach has brought the research out of the factory gates and have broadened the dimensions of workplace behavior studies. Now, the society of different workers, their possible origin and community experiences are also being studied to understand their attitude and behavior at work. Nevertheless, this approach has also been criticized from time to time on various grounds. First of all, it has been pointed out that all employees cannot share same priorities regarding their employment. In such a scenario, such myriad of priorities cannot be successfully investigated. Secondly, it has also been seen that single overriding priority cannot dictate orientation to work, as every individual are motivated by innumerable objectives. It is also said that only non-work factor cannot be the driving force towards orientation to work. Finally, researchers argue that it is not possible to have the workforce to be self-selected in all the cases. Such a situation will not only need relatively full employment, but also require availability of opportunities to satisfy the worker's objective. This will also mean that a worker will have to possess adequate knowledge of the characteristics of job. Such orientation with work seems unlikely in the absence of detailed and accurate information about jobs as well as unemployment or limited range of job in particular areas. To conclude, human behavior is unpredictable, and as such, few simple rules and theories cannot categorize or fully explain its scope. This is the reason why so many studies have been made to understand the workplace behavior, but none can adequately sum up reasons, categorize factors, or resolve problems all by themselves. As an aspect of sociological study, the workplace behavior will also need an interdisciplinary approach like many other aspects of social science. In due time, when the inputs and findings derived from other social science like history, politics, and economics are studied, only then we might get a clear understanding of behavior at workplace. Finally, from various approaches that we studied in this discussion, it can be concluded that behavior cannot be studied solely on the basis of social factors, economic factors, technological factors, complexity in man, or orientation to work. In some recent studies, scholars have suggested that many factors interplay and interact together in guiding behavior. As such, only a comprehensive study of all these factors can help us truly understand workplace behavior. Any sociological analysis will have to take into consideration structure, physical and social constraints on human action and different approaches to understand a given situation. In the recent past, capitalist labor process, historical specificity and variability of shop floor along with social relations are being analyzed while studying workplace behavior. Similarly, the work of classical economics tailors empirical methods from scientific management as well as the work of physiology and psychology approach are also being revived in studying the workplace behavior.